Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween to you.
Neon Night Forever, Continued, Part 1, Section 2. Camp Night, Dad Night, or Cute Night, Exploring the Foundations of the Neon Night. In his explicitly titled article, Why Batman Movies' Obsession with Realism Hurts the Dark Knight, in 2021, Anthony Borelli advances a valuable argument concerning the excessive and strongly compulsive striving to embed the hero in the realm of realistic stories, as in the acclaimed Christopher Nolan trilogy. According to Borelli, quote, "This Batman gives audiences a taste of what they had been missing in the films more concerned with practicality than theatrics. Unfortunately, this does more harm than good in respect to the Dark Knight's on-screen potential. While realism is great for exploring Batman's inner state, it inadvertently places limitations on the creative aesthetic of the character. All black-armored Batman suits are perfectly acceptable and impressive, but it's not the same as seeing Batman in black and gray. Sadly, the black and gray is often one of the first casualties to realism, as it's less practical for stealth operations. The same goes for the Batmobile, where style is often lost in favor of utility. Part of Batman's appeal is his aesthetic and theatricality, which is not always practical." End quote. The realization that this so-called practicality leads to a more realistic rendition of the Batman character is an interesting addition to the previous discussion about the general reception of the Dark Knight's persona, as it highlights yet another ingredient commonly affirmed by the most orthodox fans, namely heavy reliance on that particular, like in real life, quality. It is true that over the years, Batman has been recognized as the superhero best suited to be presented in this particular manner, one who could be most readily associated with potential vigilante acts taking place in the world outside the reader's or viewer's window. The basic lack of any superhuman abilities, dependence on fantastic but not practically inconceivable gadgets and vehicles, as well as the consistently expanding lore of Batman's physical strength and intelligence, the result of long years of training, all seems to call directly for a realistic setting and the presence of a non-supernatural Avenger whose deeds bring SWAT operations to mind. Yet another paradox of Batman's creation, as Borelli aptly argues, is the almost organic hybridity of a character who has to reconcile practicality with a significant amount of graphic theatricality resulting from the overly dramatic or even downright cartoonish nature of Batman's superhero exploits, with a gallery of equally outlandish villains to boot. The effort to place Batman in a setting of commonly understood realism, a striving for a verisimilar depiction of Batman's actions and endeavors, or, in other words, their ability to be imagined within the established laws of physical and psychological worlds, can be seen as yet more proof of the Dark Knight's core understanding, whereby the darkness connotes seriousness so as to automatically preclude any forms of silliness that could damage the character's realistic vigilante look. This is openly asserted by Mark S. Reinhardt in his definitive The Batman Filmography, where the author strongly criticizes Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin for being too remote from the limits of the realistic approach. As Reinhardt puts it, quote, "But as bad as Batman and Robin's formulaic nature is, the film has even bigger problems. Namely, it is completely divorced from any sense of reality. As discussed last chapter, Batman's forever use of computer graphics technology perhaps gave Schumacher and company too much freedom, because it allowed them to stray far beyond the boundaries of what a hero like Batman could do if he were actually a real person. This problem was magnified tenfold in Batman and Robin. Characters are flying through the air at impossible speeds and trajectories, cars are being driven over wildly uneven terrain, and roads suddenly dead-end right in the middle of bridges that look to be 50 stories off of the ground." End quote. This particular section in Reinhardt's work describes in detail how Schumacher's films depart from the expected image of the characters and, in fact, identify the entire narrative and aesthetic ecosystem that the more serious nature of these heroes should involve. As regards Batman and Robin, Reinhardt censures the film's excessively bright and pastel-colored tonality, even more immoderate re-homosexualization of costumes with the notoriously conspicuous rubber nipples, and misguided color palette. Finally, there is a garish quality to Gotham City resulting from accentuated shades of magenta, orange, and lime green. These colors did not seem to match up with the images of the dark, shadow-lined streets of Gotham City. After a comprehensive critique of the look with which Schumacher endowed his Batmen, Reinhardt makes a final statement that could serve as an unequivocal apotheosis of the proper Dark Knight's portrayal. This combination of non-Batman costumes and non-Batman colors made Batman and Robin feel like a non-Batman film. Even so, Schumacher's films are actually far from being the first to be ostracized for flouting Dark Knight's dark look. Nor were they the first to be regarded as acts of softening the character by avoiding brutalism and tonal grittiness. In the history of the Bat-related Bat media, the title of the most tonally challenging and pastel-dominated vision still belongs to the classic Batman TV show, which debuted in 1966, while its Camp Knight became an antecedent to the younger incarnation of the Neon Knight. Chronologically, that particular vision was not the first ever to attempt to deliver an undarkened idea of Batman. As already observed, Batman comics would consistently lighten the mood right after Robin appeared in the 1940s. But for the regular Batman consumer, Adam West's interpretation remains the most iconic portrayal of a lighter vigilante. Throughout the decades since its first release, the ABC show tended to be associated with the notion of camp, which the successive film scholars and critics such as Will Brooker, Roberta E. Pearson, and William Uricchio, Glenn Weldon, and Jeffrey A. Brown repeatedly confirmed, noting that the producer William Dozier often invoked the concept in the sense coined by Susan Sontag, as a serious approach to thematically and visually ridiculous material. Here, however, it is necessary to reconsider the campness of the 1960s Batman as a direct opposition to the widely shared notion of the Dark Knight's serious nature. The essential philosophy behind the show was probably summarized most accurately by its head screenwriter, Lorenzo Semple Jr., whose formula was cited in Batman, a celebration of the classic TV series, an art book by Bob Garcia and Joe Desrees. Quote, I conceive this whole thing being so gorgeously square that it's hip, so far out that it's in. No necessity to make it modern by using teenage slang and whatnot. Indeed, on the contrary. End quote. Semple Jr.'s words reflect the peculiar nature of the show, simultaneously highlighting the hybrid nature of Batman's rendition. It is steeped in the 1960s visual and tonal style, yet it tries to remain a distanced approach toward the tenet of up-to-dateness by keeping Batman in a tension between countercultural spin and a straight superhero fantasy, good and proper. To sustain such a paradox of the show in no way resorts to any sort of realistic flavor. On the contrary, it manifests its penchant for radically unrealistic performance and technical execution quite vulgarly. Again, it would be most fitting to cite one of the 1960s Batman main contributors, namely Jack Center, who was the series' art director. The latter stated in Garcia and Desirie's art book, quote, Our impromptu Batcave was exciting to look at because the true source of it all was a comic book. We wanted credibility, but we didn't want reality. End quote. The story is pretty much known from that point on. The 1960s Batman became a synonym of the unrealistic comic booky approach, favoring the appeal of graphic narratives of the Golden and Silver Age, utilizing their pastel, bright, and unrealistic color schemes, and introducing equally nonsensical exploits where noisy timbre amplified the tension. Without doubt, the approach aimed to deliver the not-so-Dark Knight in visual and psychological terms, as Batman's appearance and behavior would not correspond with the paradigm of a serious hero. It was something of an ulterior motive to demonstrate the real possibilities of the newly marketed color TV sets, which is why Batman keenly explored all the aesthetic unrealism one could achieve at the time by designing the film language of the series and the on-screen exploits using every available film trick, including extensive use of Dutch angles, iconic onomatopoeias, characteristic voiceovers that commented on the events in a manner of narratory blocks in comics, or the extremely pop art-like effect in character appearance. Costume designer and wardrobe manager Jan Kemp recalls, quote, When I received the assignment to work on the Batman series, I decided to get every copy of the Batman comic books that I could lay my hands on. I soon realized this project would require a different approach in regard to costumes, and I decided to give the actors a vivid combination of colors and styles that had not heretofore been used in films or television. and by so doing translate into real life the garish look of the comic book pages. The idea being that television as a medium was stereotyped and that it could only carry certain colors. I claimed, and was later proven right, that we could use all sorts of ultra-violent colors and get away with it. End quote. Still, one could ask about the actual positive corollaries of juxtaposing that Camp Knight with the much more acceptable appearance of the Dark Knight. In other words, why exactly should the Camp Knight be as valid as his most serious and realistic counterpart? Mark S. Reinhardt observed in his own appraisal of the 1960s interpretation that the very introduction of that campy character was a crowning act in a much longer-term strategy within the DC Comics, which actually accelerated the process of softening the character, initiated in 1940s and successfully continued in the 1950s, following Frederick Wertham's critique of the subtextual gayness of Batman and Robin's relationship. In conjunction with the alleged taste for violence, it culminated with the infamous Silver Age comic book Knight facing sci-fi themes and dangers, a Martian attack or sudden appearance of a giant ape. William Dozer's Batman surely derived from that frivolous understanding of the Caped Crusader. All the same, having intensified the characteristics typical of the Silver Age, it achieved the goal of demonstrating the not-so-obvious advantages of disengaging the Dark Knight from the shadowy realms. According to Will Brooker, the unexpected and still insufficiently appreciated legacy of the 1960s Batman consists in the aesthetic alternative to the most common visualization of Batman as a dark figure, waiting in a dark alley for a black-coated crook, in the night. No matter how iconic this image may be to the audience, it certainly does not exhaust the capacity of the graphic imaginings of Batman that work equally well when saturated with more visible, or, as Jan Kemp stated, ultra-violent colors that yield less brooding but similarly awe-inspiring image of a superhero in action. The artistic possibilities of portraying Batman's adventures can be readily expanded by making them more graphically abstract or absurd, in a creative and entertaining fashion, than the standard depiction of a gargoyle-like vigilante. Brooker sums it up thus: "An obsessively dark Batman, after all, is potentially flatter than any pop canvas. To achieve any degree of subtle, rounded shadowing, readers and producers alike may have to accept Batman in his costume of 1968, as well as that of 1986, in his camp as well as his sinister mode, in light as in darkness." End quote. At any rate, the faithful followers of the essential Dark Knight capable of accepting the camp stylistics over the years had an even bigger pill to swallow. As Drew Morton suggested, there was yet another aspect of that particular interpretation which, in all likelihood, remains the most problematic aspect of the Camp Knight's legacy: the transformation of a hyper-masculine macho ideal into a Bat-Dad persona. The major success of ABC's Batman with viewers. On its debut, the show received a phenomenal rating of 27.3 out of 49 from the American audience, as documented by the report of the Nielsen Institute, was followed by an equally aggressive and enthusiastic rise of Batmania, evinced in the tremendous volume of Bat-related merchandise and everyday products. The other consequence of the series starring Adam West was growing demand to know more of the Caped Crusader's exploits, as the main target audience, children and young teenagers, are certain to have developed bat fever in 1966. The show itself ran for 3 seasons, ending on March 14, 1968, and spawned an iconic cinematic feature directed by Leslie H. Martinson in 1966 and distributed by 20th Century Fox as a direct companion to the hit television production. The William Dozer-inspired iteration of the Camp Knight did manage to continue in other forms of popular media which, albeit not treated as explicitly integrated sets of narratives within the 1966 Batman sub-universe, were nevertheless too close to its manifest nature and aesthetic to be treated as something other than semi-official spin-offs. The first of those was the animated show The Adventures of Batman, produced in 1968 by the iconic Filmation studio for the CBS network. The cartoon debuted in the U.S. on September 14, 1968, nearly 6 months after the last episode of the live-action series. It was made by the Filmation Company, who specialized in express production of low-budget cartoons and animated shows in its peak period between '63 and '89. Even before The Adventures of Batman, the company were known for the rather limited quality of their titles, reflecting the fittingly defined limited animation technique preferred by the studio. Nonetheless, the Filmation studio, founded by Lou Scheimer, Hal Sutherland, and Norm Prescott, managed to create quite an impressive library of characters and popular series over the years, including The Hardy Boys, Archie's TV Funnies, Star Trek the Animated Series, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and Ghostbusters. Most notably, Filmation was the very first animation company to adapt the iconic characters from the DC portfolio, starting with The New Adventures of Superman, The Adventures of Superboy, and the Superman-Aquaman Hour of Adventure, followed by The Adventures of Batman, Shazam, and the successive sequels to the Caped Crusaders adventures, The Batman Tarzan Adventure Hour, Batman and the Super Seven, and The New Adventures of Batman. Being an indirect offspring of the ABC's 1966 Batman, the Filmation material did share some similarities in terms of the general tone and narrative inputs, which could be recognized in the new animated guise. The voiceovers of the main duo, Batman and Robin, were provided respectively by Olan Soule and Casey Kasem, who clearly tried to imitate the original delivery of Adam West and Burt Ward from the live-action incarnation of both characters. Similarly, the new exploits drawn by Filmation's artists emulated the ridiculous stories of the predecessor, with a well-known rogues gallery including the Joker, Penguin, Riddler, and Mr. Freeze, who all came up with elaborate stratagems. The very first episode, My Crime is Your Crime, showed the Joker and Penguin devising a diabolical scheme to make Batman wrongfully accuse them of crimes they have not committed and stand trial as a result. As modern fans openly admit, The Adventures of Batman and its Filmation follow-ups represented an artistic low point of the character, given the technical shortcomings, while the goal was to exploit the fond memories of Adam West's show among the actual target audience, children, and to profit from the sentiment. The author of a throwback article published on the 13th Dimension website admits, quote, "Filmation was schlock, lovable schlock, but schlock nonetheless. However, this was still a studio staffed with talented artists, and you could really see it in the many evocative matte paintings and effects utilized throughout the show. I also really dig the vehicle designs." End quote. There surely is not enough genuine innovation in the structures or themes of those stories to constitute any substantial reading of that particular rendition of The Bright Knight. But there may be another interesting element which manifested there, although not entirely intentional, namely the previously intimated original appearance of the Dad Knight. As Will Rogers notes in his comprehensive study of the Super Friends animated show, Filmation's Batman may be considered the first implementation of Adam West's visually campy vigilante without the double import of the live-action show, which it delivered through double entendres or hidden meanings that may have gone over the heads of children, but would have been grasped by the adult viewers. Rogers sums up the schlocky original Batman cartoon thus, quote, "The Batman series is reminiscent of the TV series, but without the camp." End quote. If the original take on the campy knight involved the clash of straight-faced characters and much more ludicrous settings with a surreptitious wink towards the adults, The Adventures of Batman focused on the straight heroes facing farcical perils, but dispensed with the obscure allusions to the camp-related sexual aspect that was noticeable in the 1966 ABC production, as the inevitable effect of the artistic course that had been taken. However, The Adventures of Batman, a product developed with children in mind, intentionally focused on enhancing the cartoonish and bizarre elements, just as the Batman comics in the 1950s gave preference to science fiction to avoid any concerns about the hero's sexuality as they explored fantastic worlds and faced even more unearthly dangers. Interestingly enough, when Filmation took over Batman's lore, continued later as part of Hanna-Barbera's cult lineup of various Super Friends, in a series launched in September 1973, the diegetic function of the character shifted tangibly from partner to a parent of Robin's, his young charge and associate in the crime-fighting business. Filmation's contribution, additionally augmented by Hanna-Barbera's tenure over the character in the 1970s, which followed the guidelines of the advocacy group Action for Children's Television, sanctioned an interpretation of the Dad Knight as a responsible and protective persona, always ready to give a moral lesson rather than a brutal punch. That particular portrayal was discussed by Will Rogers, who, in an analysis of the Super Friends series, aptly defined the parenting qualities of the core members of the supergroup. Quote, Superman was a dad who could fly. Batman was a dad with a pointy-eared cowl and a utility belt. Aquaman was a dad who could swim. Wonder Woman was a mom with a lasso, bracelets, and an invisible jet. And Robin was a big brother sidekick. End quote. Thus, the Dad Knight emerged out of the not-so-dark shadows of the Camp Knight, a figure possibly even more remote from the Dark Knight iteration of Batman and much more of a moral mentor than the Batusi-dancing Adam West, who now seemed a vigilante of adequately adult proportions in comparison. The combination of the visually aggressive camp Batman and the overtly children-oriented Dad Knight would yield yet another crusader to close the list of the pre-Neon Knight embodiments, namely the Toy Knight, or as Jeffrey A. Brown recently phrased it, the mysterious action figure of the Cute Knight. The story of the Cute Knight must be seen in relation to the 1966 Camp Knight, as the version of Batman portrayed by Adam West is an indisputable benchmark for many different Bright Knights over the years. With the advent of the future hit television show starring the Caped Crusader, another secondary offshoot appeared in 1966 when Ideal Toys launched a Batman variant of their original Captain Action doll. In the new 9-inch line of 9 plastic superheroes, with Batman, Superman, Aquaman, Captain America, The Phantom, The Lone Ranger, Steve Canyon, Flash Gordon, and Sergeant Fury thrown into the mix as well. Obviously, due to the soaring popularity of the ABC production, the toy Batman was made to resemble the on-screen portrayal of the Crusader, and imply that it was an official reproduction of Adam West's costume look. However, in a study concerning the evolution of Captain Action, Michael Ury observes, quote, Ideal Toys did not include the blue bat-winged gloves that Batman wore in the comics and on television, despite their depiction of the package illustration. The box art also shows Batman wearing his traditional yellow utility belt, which is blue in the Captain Action version. End quote. Although lacking direct correspondence with the depiction in audiovisual or graphic media, the desirability of that particular material form of Batman was boosted by other means, a wide range of extra gadgets and items that translated into extended playtime. As Ury recalls, besides the obvious cowl, uniform, or cape, the package included typical Caped Crusaders devices, the utility belt with a two-way radio, the batarangs, a flashlight, a laser torch, grappling hook, and a bat rope with reel. This original presentation of Toy Batman follows the merchandise-driven logic of converting intellectual property into consumable objects, elucidated by Dan Fleming in his comprehensive study on the process of using film or TV-based figures and sets to negotiate between the structure of the narrative to which a product refers and the user's spontaneous and individual act of playing, whereby they conceive and add new meanings on top of the original media content. As Fleming observes, the process of redefining a children's toy, where it transitioned from miniaturized or simplified items of everyday use, e.g. trolleys, cars, or construction tools, to spectacle-based objects, imitating the characters and events that a child could witness in the cinema or watching television, sped up significantly after the advent of Saturday morning shows for kids in the 1980s, with Transformers and G.I. Joe franchises the most merchandise-oriented instances of such toyetic narratives. However, the process dates to much earlier times. In his analysis, Fleming looks as far back as 1811, citing the staging of Mother Goose in London, which gave rise to the local phenomenon of William West's Toy Theatre. Essentially, it exploited a popular performance to garner children's interest in a line of items associated with the Mother Goose play available in West's department store. According to Fleming, such an approach to a toy, or an action figure or collectible figure in modern nomenclature, which sees it as a component of multimedia spectacle produced in a situation in which, quote, with clearly established teams or characters and basic story structures that would generate endless plots around these characters, children could certainly watch and read plenty of given examples, but were also being encouraged to extend those with their own variations. End quote. The subconscious danger of introducing characters like Batman into the sphere of officially undirected play modes generated by means of the growing legion of action figures and vehicles was probably the worst fear for any guardian of the Dark Knight's true canon. potentially culminating in loss of control over its dark nature due to the distinct logic of the toy manufacturers and increasing customization on the part of the consumers. To see how that customization evolved in a historical and commercial context linked to some degree to Schumacher, one should probably consider one of the most notorious line of Batman-related toys, the 1994 series Legends of Batman produced by Kenner, a company associated with Batman merchandise for a very long time. Although Kenner's approach to the plastic-caped Crusader, since the producer launched a massive Batman-centered offensive in 1990 with the Dark Knight collection, always adhered to the logic of multiplying Batman's variations with changing accessories and/or color palettes of the toys. The 1992 range associated with Batman Returns included the lavishly yellow deep dive scuba-equipped Batman figure and the jungle camo Air Attack Batman. The Legends of Batman epitomized the most far-fetched vision of the plastic Crusader. To name just a few products in the series, there were more accurate Batman depictions, faithful to the contemporary comics and films, such as Night Quest Batman and Night Send Batman, from the respective comic book sagas, and the Crusader Batman, the thoroughly unalloyed representation of the comic book Batman in the classic black and gray costume. Other items were definitely more troublesome for the Dark Knight's purists, as they included the Viking Batman with a giant axe, the Cyborg Batman with Terminator-like prosthetics, the Samurai Batman with an exaggerated Japanese katana, and the Pirate Batman crossing his sword with an equally pirate-esque villain Two-Face in an exclusive 2-pack. The Legends of Batman toy line directly predated a later range of Batman-related products to accompany none other than the 1995 and 1997 Joel Schumacher Batman films, which would become the principal reference for the upcoming figures for mainstream consumers. Still, the approach adopted with the Schumacher-inspired toys had originated a little earlier in the history of the toy knight. Its chief intention was to be able to develop and market Batman products that went beyond the limited dark personification. As previously noted, the most applicable term in the present-day discourse concerning Batman's manifestations as a toy or a consumer object was advanced by Jeffrey A. Brown in his analysis of the cute aesthetic, now commonly associated with literally every intellectual property that can be portrayed in such a guise. Brown asserts, quote, "In an effort to appeal to children and nostalgic adults, superheroes have embraced the aesthetic of cuteness. Despite the contemporary Batman's dominant characterization as grim and gritty, his likeness is everywhere as a friendly image for youngsters. With big eyes and an impish smile, Batman and so many other heroes exist as cuddly plush dolls, friendly Lego characters, silly cartoons, and baby clothes. The cuteness of these variations reconfigures the violent and traumatic side of superheroes like Batman and repositions them as figures in need of our love and support, deserving of cuddles." End quote. With the powerful presence of the Dark Knight's likeness by Funko Pop, Cos Baby, Lego, and Dorbs, the privatization of the erstwhile Batman character is apparently approaching its inevitable end, seeing that, as Brown suggests, the very image of Batman and his material presence assumes a fragile and vulnerable aspect of a not-so-dark vigilante, positioning itself in a striking position to the preferred reading of a hypermasculine brute. This merchandise-driven journey from the early Captain Action-based iterations of Batman through the 1990s stylistically varied Kenner series towards the most recent Festival of the Cute Knights heralds the ultimate and probably most outrageous reading of the not-so-dark knight concept, which involves no less than the rejection of the dark characteristics of Batman as a deadly serious or utterly realistic hero. To draw again on Jeffrey A. Brown, the modern fascination with the cute knights may also be interpreted as willingness to acknowledge and rework the oft-noted element of toxic or hypermasculine ideals that the figures of American superheroes celebrate, whereby the lonely vigilantes witness erosion of their established qualities, being invulnerable or tough in favor of being emotional and cute. According to Brown, quote, "When superhero characters conform to an aesthetic of cuteness, they embody the exact opposite traits valorized in the original superhero style. Their cuteness exaggerates signs of softness, weakness, and helplessness. In gender terms, the cute superhero is repositioned as feminized and infantilized, as sweet and cuddly rather than tough and strong." End quote. This final element of cuteness completes the triad of the knights who appear to be the most remote from the popular image of the Dark Knight, and the trinity of traits which, according to many, should never feature in an accurate depiction of Batman. The Camp Knight's intensity and humorous touch, the Dad Knight's nurturing approach, and the Cute Knight's emotional vulnerability and toyetic flavor no doubt combine to form a complex of the Bright Knight's most unsettling alternatives to the most classic Batman depictions. But do they really qualify to be treated as bad or wrong? The goal of this chapter was to underscore the principal concept of what is commonly referred to as the floating signifier, although it is frequently confined to the numerous depictions of the Dark Knight that maintain the gray and black scheme. The thing is that there genuinely could and should be consent for the Rainbow Batman to be in evidence in all narratives or consumer products, manifesting a wide range of Batman readings that could symbolically reposition the character outside his initial noir setting, in domains which do not have to satirize the figure but enable new thematic, artistic, and commercial exploits. Finally, it needs to be affirmed that there is a Batman for everyone, since the figure proved so flexible in accommodating even the most far-off forms and meanings, while each such incarnation should be considered viable and relatable due to changing historical or participatory contexts. Nick Mamatas rightly concludes that Batman is nothing more than a set of musical and graphical images and connotations, a bat-shaped emblem and a bat-themed costume, a moody score by Danny Elfman and a catchy Neil Hefti song, topped with a depiction of the hero chasing the Joker that works well in dark hues and pastels alike. The longevity of the character actually requires a more inclusive look at the tonal and thematic spectrum, which should involve as many disparate readings as possible to constantly diversify the Bat universe populated already by the Dark Knights, Camp Knights, Dad Knights, Cute Knights, and many other knights to come. Nevertheless, there is one particular vision among them which continues to be one of the most unique and the most unacceptable, irrespective of the many personal readings of what the Batman character may be, how he may be portrayed, and what new understandings he is capable of engendering. The variant in question is Joel Schumacher's Neon Knight, a cumulative sublimation of the main three earlier iterations of the Bright Knight discussed previously, substantially updated by virtue of Schumacher's very own style and Batman's overall transmedia presence in the 1990s. As a result, the singular vision of the Neon Knight would subsume the visual flair of the Camp Knight, the Dad Knight's emotional component, and the Cute Knight's merchandise boosting strategy of supplying customized commercial Bat items. On top of this combined triad of the main undarkened knights, Joel Schumacher had his very own penchant for breaking and challenging the established artistic formulas, encompassing Batman's preconceived seriousness.